Hello everyone and welcome to the round glass review for the 7Artisans 50mm f1.8 autofocus lens. This lens arrived in 2023 and as of this video's recording in late 2024 is still available new. Typical lens uses are as a general use fast standard lens, but honestly this lens's strongest chops for stills are in the portrait department where it delivers consistently and staggeringly good images. For your bottom line up front, this is one of my favorite standard lenses and it really delivers nice images regardless of subjects. This lens has a bit of image character and honestly that character benefits images quite nicely. Your focal length and angle of view are 50mm and 46.8 degrees on full frame, 75mm and 31.6 degrees on aps-c. The aperture range is 1.8 through 16. Element and group count are 11 and 9. The design type is some kind of double gauze derivative. Filter size is 62mm. Closest focus is 50 centimeters, which in the US is 12.64% of the typical length of a CVS receipt. The autofocus drive type uses a stepper motor. The native mounts are Sony E and Nikon Z. Dimensions are 72mm by 104mm and the weight is 421 grams. For my first tip, if you're shooting in full sun, underexpose your images in camera by one stop. You can recover your shadows easily in RAW and doing so will give you dramatic clouds and better colors in your final image. This is a tip that generally applies to all lenses, but this lens in particular really benefits from this approach. As a general statement about this lens, something about the way it renders when images are shot one stop under and then adjusted in a RAW workflow seems to create images that are hyper-realistic. Next up, I love this lens for portraits and it could be a good crop sensor portrait lens, but it would also lose a lot of the image periphery character that helps create a pleasing subject isolation. Next, buy a better lens hood. The one that this lens comes with is only there to protect the front element from incidental dings and to look cool. As a means of preventing flare and ghosting, this lens's factory hood is useless. Lastly, use this lens's image character to your benefit. Wide open, the light loss is quite pleasing. Focused close, this lens isolates subjects well. This is a lens that likes being at wider apertures and close focus points, and that should be embraced. If you saw the showdown video for the 50mm f1.8 autofocus lenses, you'll know pretty much what this section has to say. From a technical perspective, this lens is not great, but let's look at what that means. Starting with the colored lights and the lens at infinity focus, we see bright lights and relatively even illumination across the channels. The aspherical elements do impart some onion ring shapes into the lights, and this stems from the milling marks on the metal molds used for the hot molded aspherical lens forming. The lens at closest focus now, and with the same lights in the frame, shows onion rings becoming more apparent and the overall illumination decreasing somewhat. This is simply a matter of how the lens performs, and it's interesting that the aspherical element fingerprints are more pronounced at close focus. Looking at the entire dots test chart, we see good contrast and pincushion distortion that pulls the periphery dots inward. Zooming in to 100% on the image center, we see that image quality is curious right off the bat. In the very center, it's good, but by the first ring of squares, we see strong coma that points toward the image center. And that, insofar as I can tell, indicates some strong field curvature in the middle of the lens's image. This does rectify quickly, and the squares beyond the crop sensor image area are quite good, with a defined square shape and only minimal chromatic aberration of a few pixels on the 7008 pixel wide test shot. This performance is uniform around the image perimeter. Honestly, looking at the real-world shots from this lens, this is not a performance I would have ever guessed, especially not from a lens I like as much as I like this one. But if I've learned anything about myself from making this series of videos, it's that I like making images with lenses that have technical imperfections. Breathing is functionally zero. This applies to both still and motion shifts. This, combined with the lens's on-lens aperture control, autofocus manual focus switch, and exceptional fly-by-wire fine manual focus control, indicates that this lens is geared toward being as good for video as stills work. The aperture is stepped in third stops. The manual aperture control ring on the lens is a nice touch and it works well, but it still stops the lens down in third stops instead of smoothly like a manual focus and manual control lens. So just be aware of that and practice your aperture shifts to minimize or mask the aperture's fixed movements. The front element is stationary and non-rotating, as this lens has internal focusing. The focus throw on my A7 IV is 325 degrees with manual focus fly-by-wire. Focus damping for manual use is significant, and this lens feels like a manual focus lens, with the focus ring also requiring more throw at closer focus points, like a real manual focus lens. The autofocus effect on audio is not applicable, as the stepper motor is silent. I use this lens in video often, and there is never an autofocus sound on the audio track, even with on-camera audio. Sharpnesses, despite what the technical testing indicates, really good on the plane of sharpest focus. The areas outside of the focus plane transition nicely from sharp to soft and complement the sharp areas very well. Build quality is exceptional by the standards of third-party lenses. Honestly, if I had bought this with a Sony or a Zeiss sticker on it, I'd still be happy with the build quality. Except for the autofocus manual focus switch, that is. That thing flips in and out of position way too easily. Contrast is great, and that manifests as rich and deep colors that, at times, almost seem so hyper-realistic that they can appear fake. The aperture stars start to appear at f8 and get better until f16, which is where they're at their best. In terms of star quality, they are striking with many strong points and clear definition. Out-of-focus areas are highly complementary to the image subjects. Blurry areas deliver pleasing subject isolation and help make the plane of sharpest focus pop. Distortion is noticeable and in the pincushion direction. What this tells us is that the magnifying power of the elements in front of the aperture is stronger than the power of the elements behind it, and this is more noticeable at close focus points. However, in real-world use, none of the photos I took with this lens exhibit any noticeable distortion. Light loss is strong but pleasing. Light loss is present on the white screen test with the lens at infinity focus down to f8. From f1.8 to f2.8, it is strong enough to affect photos in real-world use. However, I find that the quality of light ray roll-off that this lens delivers to be quite pleasing. Also worth noting, as the white screen test shows, as this lens stops down, the color cast in the images changes and skews cool. Flare and ghosting are present, with flare being a much worse issue. When using this lens for video, I have to be mindful of light source placement, as the hood does nothing to stop individual and bright lights from flaring in the image, even if they are outside of the image. Ghosting only occurred for me one time, and it was minor. Balance with cameras is fine with heavy cameras like the A7 IV, but this lens is going to be too heavy for small cameras such as small crop sensor bodies. The 7Artisans 50mm f1.8 autofocus lens is a typical 7Artisans lens in terms of how it performs, and for me, that's good. Way back in the day, the different lens makers had different looks, what were called their own house aesthetic. By and large, with the possible exceptions of Zeiss and Leica, that house aesthetic today is gone, with most lenses from the major lens makers performing in uniformly sterile manners. If you have any questions about that, well, simply look at the showdown videos and vintage lens round glass reviews I've made on this channel. Vintage Nikons tend to have a similar look, as is the same with Canon, Minolta, and Pentax lenses. Today, Canon, Nikon, Pentax, and Sony make lenses that are so technically refined that any unique image fingerprint has been lost. Perfection has one definition. A perfect lens has a flat MTF chart and no optical flaws. If every maker were to make a hypothetical 50mm lens that met that definition, then they would all perform in the exact same manner. The flaws in different lenses' optical designs are what creates the variation and image character that we like in those lenses' performance. And so the way that this lens works, the imperfections, create the very aspect of the optical character that I like. Each of the current third-party lens makers has some aspect of their lenses that creates a look that is their own. That house aesthetic is a benefit to those makers, and returning to a time when lenses had a definitive house aesthetic is a lesson that the OEMs could benefit from. Hey, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one you'll probably really like too.